In the heart of the modern metropolis, where towering skyscrapers cast long shadows over bustling streets, a sinister presence lurked. The world had changed, and with it, the nightmares of Bram Stoker had come to life. Vampires, once the stuff of folklore and gothic novels, now roamed freely among us, their fangs gleaming whitely in the neon lights of the city. Elena had always been a night owl, drawn to the city's vibrant nightlife. But tonight was different. There was an eerie stillness in the air, a palpable tension that made her shiver despite the warm summer evening. She clutched her coat tighter around her and quickened her pace, her heels clicking loudly on the deserted pavement. As she turned the corner, Elena felt eyes on her, a piercing gaze that made her heart race. She glanced over her shoulder, but saw only shadows. Her breath came in short, anxious bursts as she walked faster, her eyes darting to every darkened alley and unlit doorway. Suddenly, a figure stepped out from the shadows, blocking her path. Tall and imposing, with an aura of dark elegance, the man smiled, revealing sharp, gleaming fangs. His eyes were a mesmerizing shade of crimson, and his voice was like velvet as he spoke. "Good evening, Elena," he said, his tone dripping with an old-world charm that sent a chill down her spine. "How do you know my name?" she stammered, taking a step back. He chuckled softly, a sound that seemed to echo in the silent night. "I know many things, my dear, but you have been particularly interesting to watch." Elena's mind raced. She had heard the stories, the warnings about the vampires that had taken over the city, but she had never truly believed them until now. Fear clawed at her throat as she tried to think of a way to escape. The vampire took a step closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "Do not be afraid," he whispered. "I have no intention of harming you. Not yet, at least." She swallowed hard, her voice barely a whisper. "What do you want from me?" He smiled again, a slow, predatory smile that made her blood run cold. "I want you to understand the new order of things, to see the world through our eyes." Before she could react, he moved with inhuman speed, his hand gripping her wrist with a strength that left her powerless to resist. He leaned in close, his breath cold against her skin. "You will come to understand," he murmured, his lips brushing her ear. "And when you do, you will join us, willingly." With that, he released her and vanished into the night, leaving Elena standing alone and trembling in the empty street. She touched her neck, half expecting to feel the sting of a bite, but there was nothing. Only the lingering sensation of his cold touch and the haunting promise of what was to come. As she stumbled back to her apartment, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that her life had irrevocably changed. The city that once felt like home now seemed alien and dangerous, filled with unseen predators lurking in the shadows. She knew that this was only the beginning, and that the true horror of her encounter with the vampire had yet to unfold. The days that followed were a blur for Elena. Sleep eluded her, her dreams plagued by the vampire's crimson eyes and the chilling promise he had whispered in her ear. The once familiar rhythm of her life now felt distorted, like a song played out of tune. She moved through her daily routines in a daze, always looking over her shoulder, always feeling watched. Her friends noticed the change in her. They asked if she was okay, if something had happened. Elena forced smiles and reassurances, but the haunted look in her eyes told a different story. She couldn't bring herself to tell them the truth. How could she, when she barely believed it herself? One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Elena found herself drawn to the city's old district. The narrow, winding streets and ancient buildings felt like a different world, a place where the past still lingered. She wandered aimlessly until she stumbled upon a small, dimly lit bookstore. The sign above the door read "Forgotten Tomes." Something about the place called to her. She pushed open the door, the bell jingling softly as she stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and dust. Shelves lined with leather-bound books stretched to the ceiling, casting long shadows in the dim light. "Can I help you?" a voice asked from behind the counter. Elena turned to see an elderly man with piercing blue eyes watching her intently. There was something unsettling about his gaze, something that reminded her of the vampire. "I'm just browsing," she replied, her voice sounding small in the quiet shop. The man nodded slowly, You seem troubled, my dear. Perhaps I can offer you something that might ease your mind. Elena hesitated, then nodded. I'm looking for information. About vampires. The man raised an eyebrow but said nothing. He turned and disappeared into the maze of shelves, returning a few moments later with a worn, leather-bound book. He handed it to her with a knowing look. Read this, he said. It may help you understand what you are dealing with. Elena took the book, her fingers tracing the faded gold lettering on the cover. Thank you, she murmured. Be careful, the man said softly. The world is not as it seems. That night, back in her apartment, Elena opened the book and began to read. It was a diary written by someone named Dr. Gabriel Thorne, a vampire hunter from centuries past. His entries detailed encounters with vampires, their strengths, their weaknesses, and most importantly, their plans. One passage stood out to her. They walk among us, hidden in plain sight. They have infiltrated our institutions, our governments, our very way of life. Their goal is not merely to survive, but to dominate, to turn humanity into a herd, cattle for their insatiable hunger. But they fear the light, both literal and metaphorical. Knowledge, too, is a weapon against them. As she read, a chill ran down her spine. The vampire who had confronted her was not an isolated incident, it was part of something much larger, much more sinister. The pieces began to fall into place. The strange disappearances, the rise in violent crimes, the way the city seemed to grow darker each night, it was all connected. Determined to learn more, Elena delved deeper into the diary. Drive. Thorne had documented a secret society of vampire hunters, a group dedicated to fighting the creatures of the night. They operated in the shadows, just like the vampires they hunted, their identities hidden even from each other. Elena knew she had to find them. They were her only hope of understanding what was happening and how to stop it. But the diary was old, and many of the contacts and safe houses listed within it were likely long gone. Still, it was a start. She made notes, tracing the paths outlined in the diary, trying to piece together the network of hunters that Dr. Thorne had written about. She felt a flicker of hope, a sense of purpose. She wasn't alone in this fight. But as she closed the book and looked out her window at the darkened city, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The vampire's words echoed in her mind. You will come to understand, and when you do, you will join us, willingly. The true horror of her situation was becoming clear. The vampires were not just predators, they were orchestrators of a grand design, one that she was now unwittingly entangled in. And somewhere in the shadows, the vampire who had marked her was waiting, watching, and planning his next move. Elena knew that the intrigue was only beginning, and that the real terror lay ahead. She was stepping into a world of darkness, where every light could be an enemy, and every shadow could hide a monster. But she also knew she had no choice. The fight for humanity's survival had become her own, and she would see it through to the end, whatever that end might be. Elena's search for the vampire hunters led her down many dark alleys and into forgotten corners of the city. Her first breakthrough came when she deciphered a coded message in Dr. Thorne's diary, pointing to an old library hidden beneath a crumbling cathedral. This secret sanctuary, concealed by centuries of dust and decay, promised answers and allies. One rainy evening, armed with only a flashlight and a sense of determination, Elena made her way to the cathedral. The city around her was alive with the hum of nightlife, but this part of town was eerily silent. The cathedral loomed ahead, its Gothic spires reaching skyward like skeletal fingers. She pushed open the heavy wooden doors, their creak echoing through the vast, empty nave. The air inside was cold and damp, and the smell of mold and mildew was overpowering. Elena's footsteps echoed as she walked down the central aisle, her flashlight casting long, flickering shadows. Following the directions in the diary, she found a hidden door behind the altar, its frame covered in intricate carvings of angels and demons locked in eternal struggle. With a deep breath, she pushed it open and descended a narrow spiral staircase that seemed to go on forever. At the bottom, she found herself in a vast underground library. Shelves upon shelves of ancient books and scrolls filled the room, and the air buzzed with an almost palpable sense of history. Elena's flashlight revealed a large wooden table in the center of the room, cluttered with maps, documents, and strange artifacts. She was not alone. A figure emerged from the shadows, a tall man with graying hair and a stern expression. He regarded her with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. Elena swallowed hard, clutching Dr. Thorne's diary to her chest. "My name is Elena. I found this diary, and I need help. The vampires, they're everywhere." The man's eyes widened as he saw the diary. "Drive. Thorne's journal," he whispered, more to himself than to her. "It's been missing for centuries." "How did you come by this?" "I was given it by a man in a bookstore," Elena explained. "He said it would help me understand what I'm dealing with." The man nodded slowly, his suspicion giving way to a hint of respect. "My name is Marcus. I'm one of the few remaining members of the Order of the Sun. We are the descendants of those who fought alongside Dr. Thorne." Elena felt a surge of relief. She had found them. "I need to know how to fight them," she said urgently. "I was confronted by one. He said I would join them willingly." Marcus's expression darkened. "They are cunning and powerful, but they are not invincible. The knowledge in this library can help you, but it will not be easy. The vampires have eyes and ears everywhere." He led her to a table covered in maps of the city, each one marked with symbols and notes. "These are their known hideouts and territories. We've been tracking them for years, trying to disrupt their plans. But they've grown stronger, more organized." Elena studied the maps, a sense of dread settling in her stomach. The vampires were not just scattered predators, they were a coordinated force with a strategy. "What do we do?" she asked. "We fight back," Marcus replied. "But we must be careful. They are always watching, always listening. Trust no one outside this room." Days turned into weeks as Elena immersed herself in the Order's work. She trained with Marcus, learning the ancient techniques and rituals that had been passed down through generations. She studied the weaknesses of vampires, from their aversion to sunlight to their vulnerability to silver and holy water. But the more she learned, the more she realized how dire the situation was. The vampires had infiltrated every level of society. Politicians, businessmen, even law enforcement, they all had their ranks of the undead. The city's very infrastructure was compromised, making it nearly impossible to distinguish friend from foe. One night, as Elena pored over a particularly old and fragile manuscript, she found a reference to a powerful artifact known as the Crimson Shard. According to the text, this relic had the ability to amplify the sunlight, turning it into a weapon that could eradicate vampires en masse. The last known location of the shard was a remote monastery in the Carpathian Mountains. Elena brought her discovery to Marcus. His eyes lit up with a mixture of hope and apprehension. The Crimson Shard. If it truly exists, it could change everything. But the journey to find it is perilous, and the vampires will stop at nothing to keep it hidden. "We have to try," Elena insisted. "This might be our only chance." Marcus nodded, determination etched on his face. "We'll need to gather allies, those we can trust implicitly. The journey will be dangerous, and once we leave the city, we'll be on our own." As they began to plan their expedition, a sense of urgency and purpose filled the air. Elena knew that the path ahead would be fraught with danger, but she also knew that she had no choice. The vampires were not just a threat to her, they were a threat to humanity itself. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine the fate of the world. Elena and Marcus, along with a small band of trusted allies, would embark on a perilous quest to find the Crimson Shard and turn the tide in the war against the vampires. But as they prepared to leave, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that the vampire who had marked her was closer than ever, ready to strike at any moment. The true battle was about to begin, and Elena knew that the intrigue and horror were only deepening. The night was dark and full of terrors, but she was ready to face them head-on, armed with knowledge, determination, and the hope that light would ultimately prevail over darkness. Elena, Marcus, and their small band of allies set out under the cover of darkness, their destination the remote monastery in the Carpathian Mountains. The journey was fraught with danger from the start. Every town they passed through, Every person they encountered carried the risk of being compromised by the vampire's influence. The group moved stealthily, relying on secrecy and the guidance of Dr. Thorne's ancient maps and manuscripts. Weeks passed, each day filled with tension and uncertainty. They encountered vampire thralls and other supernatural obstacles, but Elena's growing skills and the support of her comrades saw them through each trial. The closer they got to the monastery, the more the air seemed to thicken with a sense of impending doom. Finally, they reached the foot of the Carpathian Mountains. The monastery, a sprawling, ancient fortress of stone, loomed ahead, shrouded in mist. The air was cold and biting, the silence oppressive. "This is it," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The Crimson Shard is somewhere inside." As they approached, the heavy wooden doors of the monastery creaked open, as if expecting them. They stepped inside, torches flickering in the cold, damp air. The interior was a labyrinth of dark corridors and crumbling chambers. The group's tension mounted with every step. Deep within the monastery, they found a grand hall lined with statues of saints and angels, their expressions stern and foreboding. At the far end of the hall, on a pedestal, lay a small, intricately carved box. Marcus carefully opened it, revealing the Crimson Shard, a blood-red crystal that seemed to pulse with an inner light. Elena felt a surge of hope. This was the key to their victory. But as Marcus reached for the shard, a cold wind swept through the hall, extinguishing their torches. The darkness was sudden and complete, pressing in on them from all sides. From the shadows, a familiar voice echoed. "You have done well to come this far, Elena." The vampire, who had marked her, stepped into the dim light, his crimson eyes gleaming with malice. Behind him, more figures emerged, vampires, their fangs bared, their eyes fixed on the group. "Did you really think you could escape us?" The vampire hissed, his gaze locking onto Elena. "You were always meant to lead us here. The Crimson Shard is ours." Panic surged through Elena as she realized the truth. They had been manipulated from the start. The vampire's plan had always been to use her to find the shard, to draw out the last of the hunters and eliminate them in one fell swoop. Marcus drew his sword, but the vampires were too many. A fierce battle ensued, but it quickly became clear that they were outmatched. One by one, Elena's allies fell, until only she and Marcus remained. Desperate, Elena reached for the Crimson Shard. As her fingers closed around it, she felt a searing pain shoot through her body. The shard's power was overwhelming, coursing through her veins like liquid fire. The vampires recoiled, hissing, as the light from the shard intensified. Elena felt herself being torn apart, her vision blurring. She realized with a chilling clarity that the shard was not just a weapon against vampires, it was a beacon, a conduit for an ancient, primal force that cared little for human life. In a final, desperate act, Elena focused all her will on the shard, channeling its power outward. The hall was engulfed in blinding light, and she heard the screams of the vampires as they were incinerated. But the light was too intense, too consuming. She felt herself slipping away, her consciousness fracturing. When the light faded, the hall was eerily quiet. The vampires were gone, reduced to ash, but so too were her friends. Marcus lay still, his face peaceful in death. The Crimson Shard lay shattered at Elena's feet, its power spent. She was alone. Elena stumbled out of the monastery, the cold night air hitting her like a physical blow. She had won, but at a terrible cost. The Order of the Sun was no more, and she was the last survivor of a battle that had claimed too many lives. As she made her way back down the mountain, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed within her. The shard's power had left its mark. She felt stronger, faster, her senses sharper. But with that power came a deep, insatiable hunger. She realized, with a dawning horror, that in destroying the vampires, she had become one. The Crimson Shard had not just eradicated her enemies, it had transformed her, binding her fate to the very darkness she had sought to vanquish. The city awaited her return, a city still teeming with hidden dangers. Elena knew she would continue the fight, but now she would do so from the shadows, using her newfound abilities to protect humanity from the predators that lurked within. She was no longer a mere human, she was something more, something both terrible and powerful. The night was her domain now, And as she disappeared into the darkness, Elena vowed to use her curse to hunt those who preyed on the innocent, to be a guardian against the encroaching tide of evil. The true battle had just begun, and she would face it alone, a lone warrior in the never-ending war between light and shadow.